welcome to our panel discussion on Numata's EMEA report for 2024 on the state and the cybersecurity landscape, specifically for SMEs. So I feel it's important just for us to provide some context before we dive into all the various different discussions we're going to have with our panel of experts from around the world today. So Numata is known as the business technology strategist for SMEs, and we've had the privilege of crafting and implementing and managing technology strategies for clients in Europe, Middle East, and Africa since 2004. But over the last 5 years, we've seen an exponential increase in the number of risks our clients need to deal with. And cybersecurity seems to always hover around the top 3 spots on any of the risk registers that we manage for our clients. So as both the head of our organization and SME owner, we realized that there's little to no practical resources available for SMEs that really focus on the SME space, because there is a difference between SMEs and enterprise. And I think a report and just feedback and information that's purely educational, it's vendor agnostic, so there's no hidden sales agenda, products or services we're trying to sell, and it's purely education. We're taking the fear mongering out that is sometimes created from a marketing or sales perspective, and we're focusing just on the core and the real structure that sits behind good information security within SMEs. I also think it's important to mention just executives and business owners alike. They're continuously bombarded with information, either from vendors, from current service providers, internal IT even, around the various different solutions and services and products, and the latest and greatest threats within cybersecurity, and all that information and the overflow of information. It's causing a lot of uncertainty on executive level. People don't always know when they need to make informed decisions. You enter a state of just having too much information to actually make informed decisions and to be able to focus on the core of what good information in cybersecurity looks like. And for us, it all starts with education and awareness, and that needs to happen on an executive level. Our independent report summarizes those key concepts that is important to communicate and to understand on an executive level as a head of an organization, head of IT within an organization, even similar to us service providers. There's many service providers on this call. But I think with that being said, it actually leads me to my first point that I wanted to touch on, and just discussing, many C-level executives and heads of their organizations that I've personally spoken to over the last couple of years. They feel fatigued and overwhelmed by all this information, and either they think they're doing enough or they don't even know where to start, and it ranges quite significantly from a cybersecurity perspective. And I'll direct, I think, my first question at Chris. Just in your opinion, from an SME perspective specifically, how well do you think SMEs are prepared when it comes to handling cybersecurity incidents?
Well, in my opinion, I think that SMEs still struggle with just risk management overall, right? And cyber risk, because it has such a technological component to it, they kind of seem to err on the side that it's a technology problem or it's an IT problem, when they really don't understand that it's a risk problem. And so they need to look at it more from, hey, how's this going to impact my business? How is this going to impact my staff? What is this going to do to me reputationally? Those types of things. And I think if they start to look through it that way, I think they would embrace it more and be willing to kind of tackle, those challenges that you spoke about. I mean, I think what you just said was, most of them don't even know where to start or what to focus on first, second, and third, because there's so much information thrown at them, all sorts of different directions. And so if they can just somewhat take a pause, take a deep breath, and look at it through a business risk perspective, focus it on those things, that'll move that SME space forward. But they're still behind the times when it comes to that type of risk side of things.
And I think that's very similar in terms of what we're seeing across the space. And I know the report is focused on EMEA, but it's very similar in the US markets as well. We deal over there with SMEs and very, very similar concepts. And I think maybe, Matthew, from your perspective, when it comes to organizational maturity within that SME space specifically now, as working for and as a partner of one of the more prominent audit and advisory services firms globally, what do you see in the SME space? Do you think that maturity that Chris mentioned now, or rather the lack of, do you think that's prominent across various clients, various industries? Have you seen differences in some industries when it comes to the maturity from a risk management perspective?
Yeah, Chris, I'll tend to echo what Chris is saying. It's more a risk management issue than as opposed to a purely IT issue. And it comes back to the governance structure within an organization. You need to train the staff from the bottom level all the way up to the C-suite so they could know what to look out for. Because you get attacked over email, you get attacked all over. But to get back to your question on maturity point of view, I think listed corporations, I think they're fairly more mature than the owner-managed businesses. The owner-managed businesses tend to focus on operations and not so much on risk management. So there's definitely a disconnect between the more bigger, larger organizations with external shareholders as opposed to owner-managed businesses.
And that's a very interesting aspect, Manny. I think from your perspective as well, you deal with many organizations that typically ask you to test some of their defenses from a cybersecurity perspective. Have you seen the correlation, in your opinion, from a maturity perspective in terms of the type of organization that you deal with and what you typically find from a results perspective once you've tested those defenses? Do you think there's a correlation between the maturity and the actual cybersecurity defenses and how mature those organizations are from a cybersecurity perspective?
I don't think there's necessarily a correlation. I think a lot of the businesses that we think are mature, there's actually a lot of gaps in their defenses. I think there's lots of training and a lot of additional work to be done because it is quite a foreign concept. I think people think they are protected, but there's still a lot of gaps.
Thank you, Matthew. Manny, from your perspective, specifically posing that question to you as well, when it comes to the correlation between maturity of organizations and what they typically have in place, what have you seen with various different companies that you've dealt with over the last, almost 20 years?
Yeah, so I agree. I think when it comes to, and we've been mentioning risk management and things like that, which is true. But I think a lot of times the smaller SME, you've got to do risk management if you're not really sure how to identify the risks. So you might think you've identified what risks are important to your organization and you might think you understand them. But I think a lot of the times, the inputs that you're getting from, maybe different vendors, sometimes not the right inputs. So they might come through with fear mongering and say buy XYZ product to protect you. And if you're not mature enough to understand what your actual risk is, you might think, okay, I need to protect against malware, I need to protect my endpoints, but you're not really understanding your actual risk. And there's definitely a correlation between that and maturity. So if you don't have the right maturity around what your risk or cyber risk should be, you can't really understand how to protect against those risks. So it's almost like you just take a step back at first, get someone in. And it's actually, if you look back 20 years or so, back in the day, there was very little information around, cybersecurity and what risks to look out for and things like that. I always have the opposite problem, which is there's too much information out there. If you go on Google and you Google cybersecurity risk framework or checklist, you'll get massive checklists. If you use frameworks like SANS or LIST, whatever it is, you might even understand what's on that list. And now you start trying to implement controls. You try to meet some sort of checkbox exercise, and you start implementing controls in the wrong areas, which not maybe where your risks actually lie. So I definitely see there's definitely a correlation between like maturity and like what sort of controls you're going to put in place. There needs to be like a sort of alignment there. And it's like you always need to get the right advice. Because sometimes I always tell like a lot of us world clients is that sometimes it's better to get no advice than the wrong advice. And that's really the lesson, a point around that.
I absolutely agree with that, Manny. And I think a lot centers around, Chris, what you mentioned earlier on from a risk management perspective. There's a direct correlation between the maturity of organizations, specifically in the SME space, when it comes to the overarching maturity, risk management-wise, governance-wise as well. And I think maybe, Paul, from your perspective, SME-wise, when you look at small to medium enterprises, specifically in the EMEA region, how well do you think the average SME is prepared in terms of dealing with the cyber incident? And what are the major areas where you think improvement is drastically needed?
Yeah, so from what I see, and coming back, and it feeds in from what the guys were talking about there a few minutes ago, is that the SME area is so huge. Like in Ireland, I know it's 99% of the industry in Ireland is probably SME, so it's massive. And where I see the real difference is where the senior leadership is not bought in or is bought in. If the senior leadership is bought in, all of a sudden things happen. Companies are much more secure. When they're not bought in, it's not really important to them. What you get is you probably get the head of IT, who's the de facto cyber guy, right? We've all seen that. And that they're the ones then fighting against the current to try and put things in place. So the biggest barrier I see is actually making the senior management understand what's needed. After that, the rest are just tools. The rest are just processing of putting the blocks in place, and making sure there's a big push across the European Union on resilience with the DORA Act, with the digital reputation resilience, and then there's the Cyber Resilience Act coming in as well. So there's green shoot and need to reflect. We as an industry, we need to start putting our message together better, so the understanding is not lost in a forest of information.
Absolutely, Paul. And one of the things that you mentioned as well, and I'm going to bring it up because it's such an important, really good analogy. But in between, usually in SMEs, the head of IT being part with information security, because simply put, they don't have budget to appoint an internal CISO after that concept and aspect of information security. But one of the things that's also added on top of that plate sometimes is from a compliance perspective, could be either regulatory or legislative compliance. And there's a lot that kind of gets thrown at the SME, and they don't get absorbed in terms of just being an SME. They under exactly the same regulations and compliance requirements as some of the larger enterprises. But one of the things that I really liked that you mentioned within the report, I think it's stated as well, is you referenced it's almost like filing tax returns and how cybersecurity is done in the same way, right? And it's you reference specifically it's not a destination, it's a journey, and that ties in with the mindset that you mentioned in terms of awareness and some of those aspects. Is there something else that you wanted to comment around that? Or maybe
I kind of use that analogy a lot because I think any business owner in the world understands, right, I need to file my taxes or else I'm closed down. And unless you have a business that is totally and utterly and absolutely offline, which I'm struggling to think of one example, you are online, whether you know it or not. So you need to have some sort of cyber defense. It's a cost of doing business. Simple as that. And, the cost of having a breach and maybe having your reputation in tatters, all your customer loss in your business down, expensive. Because I did see in the report as well, one of the key concerns from SMEs was, it's expensive. No, it's not. Some of the really fancy tools and all that, yeah, some of them can be expensive. Cybersecurity and information security does not have to be expensive. It's the only thinking. It's putting the process policies in place, doing the simple things, training people. That's not expensive. Train your staff. They're the first line that's going to be attacked. They're also your first line of defense. So you don't have to have all-seeing, all-knowing matrix-style defenses and AI coming out your ears. You don't need that. Do it incrementally better.
Yes, and absolutely, and you touched on reputational risk, and Wilmore, just from your perspective, when we start talking about actual cyber incidents within that SME space and the reputational damage that can cause, I'm sure you mentioned somewhere, some organizations simply don't have the ability to actually recover from that. Can you tell us a little bit more in terms of your experience and what you've seen, and how detrimental, something like that could be from a reputational perspective?
Yeah, it's very true regarding reputational risks. With cybersecurity, they're very much tied up together, because you find that nearly every organization is kind of tied up with other ones. They may be vendors or clients or someone. And we have moved into a space now where nearly every SME needs some kind of cyber insurance. And when you are damaged reputationally, it can be very difficult to get cyber insurance. And if this company and that one, they have had breaches in the past, going to put some pressure on me to not deal with them. So it's almost becoming like a criteria of who do you deal with? Are these people safe? Have they looked after their cybersecurity correctly? Let's say the example that happened with this monitoring company, I won't name their name, that they were compromised, and it affected everybody else that was using their. For you to go there again and get that kind of a software to put in your environment, it becomes kind of like shooting yourself in the foot there, because it's going to damage your reputation, not because you have done anything wrong, but because the vendor has been compromised. So reputation is a very important thing in the cybersecurity landscape, because once yours is damaged, it's very fragile, it's very hard to put up again.
Absolutely, Bilbo. And John, from your perspective, just, what have you seen, what the impact of reputational damages across that SME space, specifically from a cyber perspective?
Look, I think it's huge. And talking about just breaches there as well. Look, I was only reading there recently, last year alone, we had the highest ransom payout ever in 2023. It exceeded 1 billion. And that's reported ransom, right? Expect another 50% on top of that. I just read in another report this morning, a local university close to my heart, again, was affected by a ransomware attack, never paid the ransom. However, the effects of the ransomware attack thereafter for them to recover is in excess of 3.5 million, right? And when you can weigh up those costs and those impacts, as opposed to if they had put the right kind of tools and controls in place in the first place, having the right tools and processes would have been a fraction of that impact. And that's something that I see consistently across a lot of organizations that I speak to. Sometimes the attitude is, look, it will never happen to me, I'm too small. But the reality of it is that bad actors don't put a label on organizations anymore. They're just going out doing a blanket attack on everybody. So unfortunately, to Wilmore's point, you could be a very, very small organization, and the cost of that financial impact from a breach can actually close your organization, because not only are you going to feel the impact of that cost, but third-party investigators, like in our case, in EMEA, GDPR commissioners could come in and they could impose, you guys are leveraging copy. So there could be big fines there, and therefore then you're bankrupt. You're not going to recover.
Absolutely, and I think I would like to touch just on a couple of things that came up now, and I think there's a lot of almost every single one of you mentioned some misconceptions when it comes to and unfounded fears when it comes to cybersecurity. But when it comes to the SME space specifically, what do you think that the most prominent misconceptions are when it comes to cybersecurity? I mean, I've heard from, it's an IT problem to, it's very expensive, but just maybe, Manny, from your perspective, what do you think that the biggest misconception is when it comes to cybersecurity within the SME space?
So I think it's like a combination of things. So like one of them is that technology can like solve the problems. So like if I buy XYZ product with the blinky lights and I put it in place, like I'm going to be safe, And I guess that comes from like how things are marketed as well. That's also one of the things, The other side of things is also that putting stuff in place without making it a part of like some sort of like framework or program, like implementing security. Just because, like, you need to onboard a client and they've asked you, they sent you a survey, a spreadsheet with, like, you must have XYZ controls. Now, because you don't have that, you start to implement those controls and you start to create those policies and you start creating those things just because you want to, pass that checklist so that the vendor can onboard you and get that sale or whatever it is, So I think, like, a lot of things is about, there's a I guess, between the two, that's really the main thing is that, just assuming that, buying the XYZ product will protect you. And the other side is just like implementing stuff without it being part of like a program or some sort of like risk management framework or some sort of governance structure, Then it becomes sort of like the Wild West where you're just implementing stuff for the sake of implementing it. And there's no like reason why.
Yeah, and that ties back into, Chris, exactly what you said earlier as well. I mean, that's exactly what you reference in terms of risk management.
Right. And I would add on to what Manny said is somebody might spend a bunch of money on a tool and they just don't understand what it takes to maintain and configure that tool on an ongoing basis. I mean, I'd say we see lots of situations where we get involved because of it's an incident, we get called in and they have spent quite a considerable amount of money on tools, and they have some pretty nice stuff, some pretty fancy stuff, but it was either configured improperly from the beginning. Features and functions that they paid a lot of money for were not enabled, and they just didn't take the time to make sure that things were configured, everything was reporting in. Not to pick on an EDR, but if you don't have it on every endpoint, and you have one or more endpoints that are not covered, well, what's the purpose? You pretty much shouldn't. You just wasted your money when you're not taking care of it. So it's right. I mean, that's another misconception is I can just kind of buy my way through managing this cyber risk, and it just doesn't work this way. It's just when I try to talk to people about it, I try to equate it to your accounting and finance. A lot of SMEs might outsource that function, but they're not going to ignore it. They're going to keep track of their finances. They're going to want reports, and they're going to want to make sure bills are being paid and money's being received and all those types of things. Same thing happens with cyber. I mean, it's a care and feeding thing. It's not a set it and forget it. And, I'm going to sleep fine tonight because I've spent a bunch of money on tools and they're going to work great.
Absolutely. And it's so funny when you mentioned that because I saw Jason, literally we dealt with exactly that scenario where, I mean, when was it, Jason? 2023, 2022, where would you mind to maybe elaborate on that, where exactly that scenario that Chris mentioned now, all the tools, the invoices were paid, Chris, like, so the level of assurance should have been there, right? And that's exactly what Jason uncovered at quite a large organization.
Yeah, it just speaks to about how we spend money, and I think Paul alluded to it earlier on, and Chris alluded to it now. And it's funny because I think every business owner knows down to the dollar and cent how much their business is earning, right, and how much they're losing or how much they're making. And yet, when it comes to information security risk, it seems like it's the third ether that they don't know anything about, or they don't want to know anything about, or as Chris alluded to, or even many that they did so because it was a checklist. It came from a third-party supplier. I want this problem to go away. I just want tick, 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 tick. And I've always said that, and Paul alluded to it earlier on, and now Chris has mentioned as well, the investment in technology is one aspect of it. I mean, we forget about the people and the processes at times, but technology alone is not the answer. And I think we know that.
And it's interesting because we had a brief discussion earlier this week, Jason. Jason's busy with a client, and we're looking at regulatory frameworks that need to be implemented from a data privacy perspective. And when we started out with a data mapping process, as an example, the client said, "Oh no, we don't have any external data. We don't share data." And as we going on, we've probably uncovered 7 or 8 different suppliers sitting with PII, so personal identifiable information, outside of the environment. And it's just by working through that and educating some of those business owners. But I think some of it also comes down to that correlation between the cyber component, information security, the IT strategy as an overarching from an architecture perspective, where we say if it's for our data, how we process it, how we work with it, how we collaborate both internally, externally. And I'm wondering, is there perhaps a discussion just around, the correlation between the maturity from an IT strategy perspective versus the maturity of cybersecurity strategy? And maybe I'll rephrase that slightly based on Chris and pretty much everyone's input here. And maybe just risk management overall, that correlation between the two from an IT GRC and IT strategy perspective. When those two aren't aligned, what would you say the biggest issues are that companies would start seeing? Or how would it manifest in an SME when your IT GRC either isn't in place or not aligned with a properly designed, crafted technology or IT strategy? And maybe, Paul, from your perspective, what do you think, how would that start manifesting into businesses?
Well, if they're not aligned, it means they haven't been put together properly in senior. It hasn't been up at the senior level. So the first thing to be thrown out is going to be the security element, because that's not what we do. We don't do security. We're a business. We sell widgets. So but they don't realize, well, yeah, okay, you sell widgets, but in order to sell those widgets, if you're breached or hacked, you're in a world of pain. I would say though, I think part of it, and I was slightly going off topic here there, but it's part of our failing as an industry is not translating what we understand to people who 99% of people who don't understand it or go phenomenal, and even down to always using the term cybersecurity. I think we need to move away from that because, okay, everyone here in the line, we're all nerds, right? We all are in this world. And when we hear cyber, oh yeah, let's talk about it. Great. Anyone else who's not involved, they start to sleep. If they're saying to me about tax, I fall asleep. I still do my tax. So we need to start talking about information security, because everyone understands information security and we want to keep the information solid. Now, if you bring that up into your strategy and talk about risk to your information, now all of a sudden it's not a separate strategy. It should be part of the overall strategy, and it's just an integral part of your overall business and our IT strategy. And I think that's in my experience, it's a more sensible way of getting buy-in from everyone and actually making sure that it's achieved.
Sorry, Coops. I just want to add to Paul's point there, because it's very important. We're setting Paul's spoken about this regularly. We often speak in language too that doesn't resonate with business owners and business leaders, and we have to ask ourselves why. And as Paul alluded to, there's a lot of terms: governance, risk, there's cyber resilience. We've got to start to demystify these things a small little bit. And I think it comes back again. I just mentioned Chris's point about the risk management approach, but equally on top of that, as I said earlier, every business knows how much to make from the pound, shilling and pence perspective. If we address risk management along with something like the FAIR model, whereby we can quantify the risk and quantify the potential exposure to the information security, I think we'll be on a better path to success in terms of getting our message across. And equally, also, the key thing that I think business owners need to understand: every business owner is in the business of IT, because if they're not in IT, then they're not in business.
That's so true, Jason. And if I could just add on to that and what Paul said, I think that's very, very true, because the more we speak about cybersecurity, kind of it positions you into a place where you are thinking you have to protect yourself and your assets from this vast sea of threat landscape, But if we say information security, it really changes the dynamic there, because you are looking now at your assets and you have to protect them. It's not so much a big thing in your mind then, to try and protect yourself against this whole sea of pirates against you, but you're just trying to protect your assets. So that's really, really a good point there.
Sorry, John.
Yeah, I was just about to say as well. I mean, look, I think a big problem as well for a lot of SMBs is that they don't exactly have a cybersecurity professional working for them. They have an IT professional that wears many hats. He's doing application, he's doing networking. He knows a small bit about security. So when it comes to his day-to-day job, he's going to focus on keeping the network up and running, keeping people logged in, keeping things, So security, unfortunately, kind of falls back in the back foot. And therefore then the need or requirement for security is not probably escalated enough up to the C-levels to make them aware of the gaps and issues within the network. And we see that right across the board. I mean, globally, there's probably 3 million open positions for cybersecurity professionals globally. That's where SMBs need to bring in professionals like us here to do maybe a consultancy session with them to identify where the gaps and needs are, to align the security strategy and their IT infrastructure and mirror the two of those together.
That's really good input, John. And just in terms of, the increase that we've seen from a regulatory compliance perspective, Paul, from your perspective, do you think that the increased pressure on small to medium enterprises, actually just all businesses across the globe, to be compliant with various different industry or legislative or data privacy regulatory compliance frameworks, do you think that is actually helping the cause from an InfoSec perspective? Do you think it's helping to educate on an executive level as well?
Yeah, and again, I'll only speak towards a European Union regulatory, okay, for a global wider audience. So that's the one I'm more familiar with. But I really believe it's the EU's doing a wonderful job on pushing resilience across the union. And I think this legislative stuff is really needed. If you look into the legislation, it's reasonable. It's asking people to take reasonable precautions, reasonable steps, appropriate to your risk. And that's the key thing. That's the key thing SMEs need to realize. It's appropriate to your risk. And if you put it into other terms, right, if I was a billionaire and I had a big, massive mansion and a huge estate and, lovely paintings and gold taps and all this kind of thing, right, I would probably need to have security guards, guard dogs, motion sensor detectors, all this, because it's appropriate to my risk. I'm not. I live in an ordinary house. I have an alarm, but when I leave the house, I turn on the alarm and I lock the door. That's appropriate to my risk level. And all the legislation is asking us to do are things like that. Just make sure you're some way secure up to what your risk, it says you should be secure to. And I think it's rising everyone's boats, and it is forcing the C-level and the senior management to actually cop on and actually take note of it and now act and make them realize that, that IT person I put in charge there who isn't really a security person, they were going on, they weren't actually talking rubbish. What they're talking about is actually real.
Yeah, and I think, Chris, from your perspective, I mean, Chris's input on some of the industry standards is quite well known. But Chris, from your perspective specifically, some of the frameworks or standards that you are involved in and help shape sometimes. And I'm starting to see a lot more of it being actually focused to the smaller markets, the smaller organizations like SMEs. What have you found in the US market? Do you think, those best practice or industry standards from an InfoSec perspective, do you think that's being adopted more widely at the moment?
I do think that you're starting to see the frameworks resonate more with SMEs. I think the standards will come next. It's a tough balancing act because I kind of cut my teeth in the banking world, and there was over here in the States, and there was a lot of banks that were doing things like we've been talking about. They were managing their risk reasonably and according to what they needed to do. Well, there's a pretty large, substantial number of smaller banks saying, we don't want to do it that way. We want it to be very prescriptive. So they were telling the banking regulators, we want a very prescriptive, what you want us to do. All the more mature banks were like, no, we don't want that. We have a handle on things. And so it was tough to satisfy both. So what happened is the regulators came out with a checklist and said, oh, this is just a guidelines. You don't need to follow it, until they showed up to do your exam and they said, hey, we want to see what you've done with the checklist. So I think the same thing goes with frameworks and standards. Is I think, Paul said it right. What the EU is doing as far as teaching people about how to handle the risk and manage the risk in a reasonable fashion. And so just as an example, the NIST CSF 2.0 just came out. It got released this week that we're speaking on this call. And I read through that yesterday completely. It wasn't, first of all, it wasn't long, which I think was good, but I was trying to read it from more of a business lens, not a technology lens. And I think the way that was written and structured is in response to what you just said. It needs to resonate with the executive level, it needs to resonate with the middle management level, and it needs to resonate with the employee level. And if you read the document and how things are explained and how they kind of laid out the order of things in that document, I think that's substantially different than it was from the prior version. So I do think that number one, people are starting to migrate towards those frameworks and standards, and at the same time, those frameworks and standards are becoming more, they're able more easily to be comprehended by non-technological people.
And I think so. That's probably why Jason forced me to be to it this week as well. So Jason, being our own CISO, is very mindful of that, balancing, the technology speak with the executive level risk in our own organization. So I have no misconception when it comes to the type of risk that we're facing. But we are fortunate from that perspective because we do have an in-house CISO that is experienced and understands that. But from the framework and a standards perspective, just maybe Chris, just for the audience today, what is the difference between a framework and a standard?
Yeah, typically one doesn't replace the other, right? If you want to think about it as a framework, it's a very flexible, if you want to call it methodology, but let's just use the term framework. It's a very flexible thing that people can choose what to apply, to what degree to apply, and basically it provides a lot of guidance to what you need to do, and typically that flows into a standard. So if you're going to adopt a standard, that's where, let's put it this way, think of it as more of an audit test, right? When you do a framework, that's kind of a self-attestation that you're managing your risk and you're doing it accordingly. When you adopt a standard, you're expecting that to be, hey, I'm doing precisely the things that this standard says that needs to be done. And I am willing to basically sign my name and have a third party prove that I'm adhering to that standard. It doesn't mean that you have to hire a third party to do it. But my point is, that's really what a standard is. Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, you're going to see companies that are regulated or that have to deal with a lot of different. They may have to deal with a bunch of different requirements from different directions. They might have regulatory requirements. They might have legal requirements. They might have contractual requirements with their vendors, their clients, or whatever. A lot of them you will see adopt one or more standards for those reasons, while other people can just say, "Hey, I need more than just a framework, and I don't quite need to go to that degree of a standard." So a little bit long-winded there, but that's how I would explain it. So
No, that's brilliant, Chris. And maybe just I've got two questions specifically related to that, but Manny, just in terms of and obviously from your background as well, I see in the background that you've got the Telspace logo up in the slogan, which is "Hackers for Hire." So just from and obviously that is what you do, right? Your entire organization exists around helping other companies to understand what their risks are from an external perspective, right? And probably internal to a degree as well. But do you think there's a correlation in terms of organizations that adopt a standard and a framework in terms of their resilience from a cyber perspective versus the ones that don't?
Bit of a tough question. I think it depends on like the organization, right? So like sometimes you have like really good teams that are really, really good at security and don't really necessarily need the framework. They're just doing the right stuff by design. So they run applications, they're hardening servers, they're doing all sorts of things that they maybe read about or learned about, and they're just doing it without the frameworks. But definitely, like I think the companies that do have frameworks and standards, they're actually looking at controls that things need to be in place. They're definitely a lot more well positioned in terms of at least having things in place that would help, in I guess reducing that risk. But I think there needs to be like a difference between having a control in place and having an effective control in place. And there's a difference between those two things. So usually when you go and you do a governance assessment or you do some sort of framework assessment or compliance check, a lot of the times you check it to see if the control's in place. Do you have an EDR? Yes. Do you have an AV? Yes. Do you have a password policy? Yes. And then we come in there and actually test, are these things actually implemented effectively? Right? So is it actually working as it should be? Is it actually reducing your risk? And you only really know that if you go and actually test that control and you actually go and see how effective is that control. And I think that's, I guess to answer your question, definitely if you've got some sort of framework and you're working towards it, I think it's definitely puts you in a lot better position. I think it's very important to highlight, like compliance doesn't mean you're secure. You can be compliant, you can have all the things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually secure. And it goes back to, I think we mentioned a few times around, technology is not the solution, but I think this might be a little bit of old school thinking because people will tell me that, it's a bit outdated. But really, you can actually take any security and break it down to people, process, and technology. If you look at your people and your process and technology around like your risk, and you start looking at where the gaps are in those areas, and you start taking like the good old information security triad, which is the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and you start to break those things down and say, like, how can I actually, if I look at this process, this business flow, where am I at risk from a confidentiality, integrity, and availability perspective, across this process? And you start breaking it down to people and process technology. Like going back to what we mentioned earlier, you get the best firewall with like AI and next gen ML and whatever label you want to it. If you have the right person knows how to configure it, roll it out, and monitor it, and actually, look at the alerts and know what's going on, doesn't really matter. So that's the people side of things. If you don't have the right process around that technology, so like anyone could go in there, change settings, like business is upset because something is blocked, they just go in there, disable something, business like slowing down a server, they turn it off. Lack of change control around that technology. Again, there's a gap there. And so, if you look at the framework, change controls in place, we've got a firewall, sure, you passed it, but it's not actually effective how you actually bring everything together. So,
as always, we didn't have enough time to run through all of the different topics that's covered in our report, but we do encourage our viewers to take a moment, download the report, and of course, the practical resources that we've included within the report as well. Some of it is guides, it's starter kits for that organization, for your organization's journey towards improved cyber resilience. But thank you very much for all of you for contributing to the report. We really, really appreciate your time and your effort, and for the viewers as well today. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you find the report very useful, along with the guides and the additional resources that will be made available. Thank you very much for joining us.